We are coming to you courtesy of Chabad of Rechavia in Jerusalem. Today is the 29th of October, the 14th of Cheshvan, and we're continuing Bezrat Hashem in our study of Rambam's introduction to Perek Chelek. Just as to bring us up to where we are right now, in the opening passages, Rambam shows us what it means to learn Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake. And he gives instructions for teachers to introduce pupils to the proper study of Torah. Interesting that we noted that when describing a child's approach to study, in other words, the child studies not for the sake of the Torah, but for getting a piece of candy or for getting some money, Rambam quotes a Mishle saying, "Answer the fool according to his folly." This is in contrast, for example, as we mentioned, to the Pietzetzner Rebbe, who was a great educator himself, who also quoted Mishle Proverbs, but he said, teach the child according to the child's own path. Rambam actually advocates the same approach, which is to say, teaching the pupil at the pupil's own level, but rather than praise the teacher for bringing the child along just up to where the child is capable of getting, he says, he calls the level of non-lishma learning deplorable. So in Rambam's world, anything that is less than full engagement of the intellect fails to accomplish the purpose of human life, which is to connect the human intellect at the maximum capacity of each individual with the intellect of God. Rambam next encourages us to a right understanding of what we learn. In the world of physicality, we can never really fully understand the meaning of Torah. But at the same time, each one of us has a unique mind, a unique set of mental faculties. Our personal purpose in life is to learn Torah Lishma, up to the limits of our individual capacity, consistent with the gifts of perception and comprehension that God gave each one of us. This is our personal task in the world, and it's part of the work of perfecting the Torah. We believe that God requires us to act as partners in the project of perfecting Torah in this world. Otherwise, why does the world exist at all? But we should be careful because our own mind prepares a trap for us. Our mind requires that everything we encounter in the world must have meaning. We hear a sound in the dark and our mind begins calculating what it means, what does it mean to us, what does it do to us. The changing temperature from day to night makes the floorboards creak, but we think, oh, is that an intruder? Do I hear footsteps downstairs? The whine of a distant car engine starting up, we mistake for an air raid siren. And as it's been pointed out, in a darkened room at night, we might mistake an armchair for a robber, but no one has ever mistaken a robber for an armchair. We tend to take things not only to mean something for us, but to mean something very meaningful or perhaps extreme for us. Our mind creates narratives around the world's random events. It takes the slightest stimuli and makes of them something of immense meaning to us personally. We have to be aware of this penchant at all times. Just because our mind craves meaning does not mean that events actually mean anything, or much less the specific meanings that we feel we automatically ascribe to them. So now as we move into today's learning, let's just refresh our memory that Rambam divides the readers of the prophetic books and the writings of the sages, of the Nevi'im and of Chazal, into three groups. First, the largest group are the gullible ones. They read every text literally, they believe the simple meaning of the words to be true, and they don't even consider that the text may have a deeper significance beyond the images and the stories that are told at the surface level. The second group is also a very large group. They believe that the texts are intended to be taken literally, and they view this as proof that the prophets and the rabbis are mentally inferior, that nobody could believe such fairy tales. And the third group, Rambam says, there are so few people in this group that Rambam hesitates to call it a group. He said, except insofar as one might call the sun itself a category, which is to say a category with only one member. These few people are clever enough to read the fantastical writings of the prophets and the sages on multiple levels, the surface meaning and the deeper message, the mashal and the nimshal. They are wise enough to recognize that these writings are parables. They are also wise enough to appreciate the artistry with which these writings are presented, while drawing the deeper wisdom from the embedded messages. This is a bit reminiscent to me of Rav Yehuda Halevi's description in the Kuzari. He describes the sense of sight. He says that the eye sees the sun as a flat disk. Am I on? Sorry, I was muted.
Rabbi, you're fine.
Okay. The eye sees the sun and perceives only a flat disk, but, says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the mind understands that it is actually a three-dimensional globe. And it seems that Yehuda Halevi's description of sight seems to border on, or maybe blend into Rambam's insistence that we should accept our sensory intake, which again our senses were given to us by God, as clarified by our rational mind. One wonders why Yehuda Halevi stops short and insists on simple faith, untainted by human intellect. So clearly in his world, there are limits to the capacity of the mind to understand reality. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi seems he was aware of the mind's capacity to trick us. And so he says that we should take perception only so far and then rely only on revelation and have simple faith in the revelation of Torah. Rambam, he was also aware of the propensity of the mind to trick itself, but rather he says the mind is actually God's unique gift to us. The intellect is, according to Rambam's definition, it is the very definition of Tzelem Elohim, of being created in the image of God. Revelation provides a framework, provides the guardrails, if you will, the guidelines for us within which we develop our intellect. But it's the intellect that must do the actual work of connecting to God. So let's dive in. Says Rambam, now you, reader, if you belong to either of the first two groups, pay no attention to my words or to anything else in this section. You won't like it. On the contrary, it will irritate you and you will hate it. How could a person who is accustomed to eating large amounts of harmful food find simple food in small quantities appealing, even though they're good for him? Remember, Rambam is also a master physician, and he combines his knowledge of his understanding of humans, the way the body works. And the body is not distinct from the mind, but they're the body, the mind, and the soul are all components of the human being. And just as we treat or mistreat the body, so we will also misuse or properly use our intellect and our other gifts. On the contrary, one will actually find them irritating and will hate them. Do you not recall the reaction of the people who were accustomed to eating onions and garlic and fish and the like? And they said, oh, now our soul has dried away. There's nothing at all. We have nothing but manna to look forward to. But if you belong to the third group, when you encounter a word of the sages which seems to conflict with reason, you will pause and consider it and realize that this utterance must be a riddle or a parable. You will sleep on it, trying anxiously to grasp its logic and its expression so that you may find its genuine intellectual intention and lay hold of a direct faith, as Scripture says, to find out words of delight and that which was written uprightly, words of truth. If you consider my book in this spirit, with the help of God, it may be useful to you. Now I can begin to discuss the matter which I'm really concerned with. Know that just as the blind cannot imagine color, as the deaf person cannot experience sound, and as the eunuch cannot feel sexual desire, so bodies cannot attain spiritual delights. Like fish who do not know what the element of water is, so are the delights of the spiritual world unknown to this in this material world. Spiritual delight experience at all. We are only bodily. We enjoy only bodily pleasures which come to us through our physical senses, such as the pleasures of eating and drinking and sexual intercourse. Other levels of delight are not present to our experience. We neither recognize nor grasp them at first thought. They come to us only after great searching. It could hardly be otherwise. We live in a material world, and we are therefore able to achieve only inferior and discontinuous delights. Right? The physical world is a world that's made up of moment to moment, change to change. The fact of choice enters into our world because of the structure of our world. We cannot go both left and right at the same time, and therefore we must choose. So these are this is the discontinuity of the physical world in which we live. In the eternal world, in Olam Haba, where Bezat Hashem we all will be, after a long life, the pleasures, the delights will be continuous. They also will not be pleasures or delights such that we can imagine in this world, as Rambam will go on to explain. Spiritual delights are eternal. They last forever. They never break off. Between these two kinds of delight, there is no similarity of any sort. It is therefore inappropriate for us who are masters of Torah or theologians to say that the angels and the stars and the spheres experience no delight. On the contrary, they really experience great delight in that they know by experience the true being of God, their creator. With this knowledge, they enjoy delight, which is both perpetual and uninterrupted. They have no bodily delight, nor could they, since they have no physical senses, as we do, through which they could get our kind of gratification. We will be like them after death. Those of us who choose to purify ourselves will reach the spiritual height. They will neither experience bodily pleasures, nor will they want them. They will resemble a powerful king who would hardly want to go back to playing ball with children, as he did before he became king. Such games attracted him when he was a child and was unable to understand the real difference between playing ball and wielding royal power. Like children, we now praise and glorify the delights of the body and do not understand the delights of the soul. So remember, this is now parallel to what we just saw last week of the Rebbe leading the child along the path according to the child's appetites, right? The youngest child says, if you read this verse of the Torah, I'll give you a piece of candy. When the child gets a little bit older, if you read this parsha, I'll give you $1. I'll give you a car. I'll call you Rebbe. I'll call you Rosh Yeshiva. And so similarly, the king, once he understands what it is to be a king, he says, why would I go back and play ball with the other kids? If you consider carefully the nature of these two kinds of delight, you will perceive the inferiority of the first, the superiority of the second, even in this world. Thus, you find that most people will exert extraordinary amounts of intellectual and physical energy laboring at ordinary tasks in order to acquire honor and to be exalted by their fellows. The pleasure which honor brings is not of the same sort as the pleasure derived from eating and drinking. Similarly, many people pursue vengeance over their enemies intensely than they pursue any bodily pleasures. Many others deny themselves the keenest of bodily delights because they fear shame and public disgrace, or because they seek to acquire a reputation for virtue. If this is the case, even in this material world, how much more must it be so in the spiritual world? That world is the world to come, Olam Haba. In the world to come, our souls will become wise out of the knowledge of God the Creator, as the higher physical bodies do, or even wiser. This spiritual delight is not visible into parts, nor can it be described, nor can any analogy explain it. It is, as the prophet said when he was awe-stricken at the lofty magnificence of that ultimate good. How great is your goodness, O God, which you have hidden away for those who fear you. Our sages also wrote, in the world to come there is no eating, no drinking, no washing, no anointing, no sexual intercourse, but the righteous sit with their crowns on their heads, enjoying the radiance of the divine presence, the Shekhinah. And this is a quote from the Gemara, the Talmud in Brachot. And again, he's in this passage, the expression with their crowns on their heads signifies the immortality of the soul being in firm possession of the idea, which is God, the Creator. The crown is precisely the idea which great philosophers have explicated upon at length. The expression, they delight in the radiance of the divine presence, means that souls enjoy blissful delight in their attainment of knowledge of the truly essential nature of God, the Creator, a delight which is like that experienced by the holy angels who know God's existence firsthand. I believe we may have said this last time, but I just want to, again, to the image which if you recall, Baruch Hashem, we finished learning Sefer Mada. If we recall at the end of Hilchot Teshuvah, Rambam also discusses the same passage of those who have learned Torah will sit in Olam Haba with their crowns on their heads and bask in the light of the Shekhinah. And the function of the crown on the head, the way I imagine it, has two purposes, if you will, or I relate to it in two different ways. One, like the kippah, which we wear to remind us that there is something above us, that we do not run things, but that there are always forces greater than ourselves, that God is always above us. The crown on the head, a crown is heavy. And so, you get used to it, but it's there. And I think it's something, on one hand, we're always aware that we have come to Olam Haba through the Torah that we learned in this lifetime and the mitzvot that we did in this lifetime. But at the same time, each one of us has our own unique derech, our own unique path to connecting to Kadosh Baruch Hu, our own unique path to understanding Torah, our own unique path to changing the world through our performance of mitzvot. And when the crown is on my head, I can't see it, but everybody else can. And so the way I kind of envision this, what I think what Rambam is saying is this becomes the huge marketplace of Torah, where each person automatically learns from every other person because we see each other's crowns. And in seeing your crown and your crown and your crown and your crown, I absorb your from the work that you did in this life. The ultimate good, the final end, is to achieve this supernal fellowship, to participate in this high glory in which the soul is forever involved with the existence of God, the Creator, God who is the cause and source of its existence and of the existence of the soul and of the goal of the soul. This has already been explained by the earlier philosophers. This is comparably good, for how could that which is eternal and endless be compared with anything transient and terminable? I think that's a typo. This is incomparably good, right? That is the meaning of the biblical statement that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days in a world that is infinitely long, add the rabbis. Utterly evil punishment consists in the cutting off of the soul so that it perishes and does not live eternally. This is the penalty of karet, to which the Torah refers, as in the phrase, the soul shall be utterly cut off. Interpreting the phrase, the sages said the word hikaret, utterly cut off, refers to the world to come. Karet in this world, hikaret in the world to come. On the other hand, Scripture also says, the soul of my master shall be bound up in the bounds of life with the Lord your God. So again, we mentioned this in the past, that Rambam, late in his life and then in the years after he passed away, was the subject of great controversy. He was accused largely by the rabbis of Provence, who had a very different worldview from the rabbis in general of Sfarad and of the Arabic-speaking world. He was accused of not believing in hell. I believe that Rambam's, if I'm correct, I believe that Rambam's actual view was exactly as he states here. You know, if there is a heaven, not being able to get into heaven, that's bad enough. The notion of hell and an eternal punishment is not necessarily part of the core beliefs of Judaism. And I believe that Rambam looked at the afterlife exactly as he's describing here. We either get Olam Haba or we fail to get it. And as we've learned in Hilchot Teshuvah, and as we will see here again, also Be'ezrat Hashem, there are lots and lots of ways for people who are not perfect to attain Olam Haba. You have to go out of your way and do an awful lot to not get Olam Haba. So the rejection of Torah in this life, and the active rejection of Torah in this life, and the active cutting oneself off from the Jewish people in this life, you have to go very far. A Jew has to go very far to lose Olam Haba. It follows that if a person has deliberately and regularly chosen physical delights, has despised the truth, and loved falsehood, that person will be cut off from that high level of being and remain disconnected matter. In other words, the neshama will be hikaret, will be cut off, and all that will remain is the bones. The prophet has already explained that the world to come bodily senses. The eye has not seen it, O Lord, except for you. The sages taught emphatically that the prophets prophesied only about the days of the Messiah, but not regarding the world to come. The eye has not seen it, only you. Now, by the way, as we will see, Be'ezrat Hashem, as we go through the 13 principles in subsequent shurim, in Rambam's world, ignorance of the requirements or ignorance of the behaviors that lose one access to Olam Haba is not an excuse. There are certain fundamental principles, 13 of them in this introduction that we're reading, that Rambam will pretty much insist are the sine qua non, that if you reject or do not embrace these principles, you lose olam haba. Now, let me explain the meaning of the promises of good and the threats of evil punishment contained in the Torah. What these promises and punishments mean is that God says, if you do these commandments, I will help you in your effort to do them and achieve perfection in them. I will remove all obstacles and difficulties which stand in your way. It's impossible for a person to perform the commandments when a person is sick or hungry or thirsty, or when a person lives in a time of war and siege. God therefore says that God will remove all of these obstacles to fulfillment so that those who strive to do the commandments will be healthy and safe until they attain the degree of knowing through which they will merit the life of the world to come. However, we must understand the ultimate reward of doing the commandments of Torah is not in any of these things themselves. If one violates the commandments of the Torah, punishments ensue. All kinds of hindrances will come into being, so the transgressor will no longer be able to perform the mitzvot. It is precisely as Scripture states, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joy and with gladness of heart by reason of the abundance of all things. Therefore you shall serve your enemy, whom the Lord shall send against you in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things. They shall put the yoke of iron upon your neck until your enemy has destroyed you. If we consider these things carefully and fully, we will understand that it is as though God were saying to you, if you do some of these commandments out of love and with genuine effort, I will help you do all of them, and I will remove the oppressive obstacles that prevent you from doing them. But if you refuse to attempt to perform any of them out of disdain of the commandments, then I will bring upon you the very obstacles that prevent you from doing all of them, so that you cannot achieve perfect existence in the world to come. This is the meaning of the statement of the sages: the reward of a commandment is the commandment itself. The reward of sin is sin. Right? Again, I think Rambam is very consistent in his understanding of how humanity works. He's saying, just like the child can only learn up to its capacity and must be enticed along the way by childish things. You can't say to a 5-year-old child, if you read this verse of the Torah, I'll buy you an Hermes necktie. Doesn't mean anything to the child. When that child grows up and is in his 20s, let's say, the Hermes necktie might be a great inducement. Okay, so you have to teach the individual according to their status, if you will, to their station, their place in life. Similarly, people will embrace, a friend of mine once put it very, very succinctly. He said, people are just as frum as they want to be. People are aware of the whole list of behaviors and a mitzvot, and yes, it's good to do this, and it's good to get up at a certain time and to pray for a certain amount of time, and it's good to learn daf yomi and to do this and to go to shirim and so on and so forth. But people say, you know what, you can't do everything, so I do what I can. And what Rambam is saying is, if we have a genuine attitude of doing what we can, of really striving, yes, there are some mitzvot that we are not capable of embracing for whatever reason. It doesn't come easily to us. I wish I had more time in the day. I don't have the time for this. I wish I had more money I wish I had more opportunities to give more money for tzedakah. And what Rambam is saying is that if we approach our embrace of learning Torah and perform mitzvot with a genuine desire to come close to God, that God will say, okay, you know what, you need some more time to be able to learn Torah. I'm going to work it out for your schedule so that you don't have to spend so much time traveling back and forth to work. I'm going to work it out for you. Rambam is saying basically that and this is a principle that's not unique to Rambam, but that God takes us along the path on which we start. In Tehillim it says, Hashem yitzilcha al yad yaminecha. God will shadow you. It's not that God tzilecha, not that God provides a shadow for you, but God shadows you on your right hand. And an interpretation of that pasuk is that God is not providing me shade. God is shadowing me. That the path that I choose to follow, God follows me along that path step by step and says, oh, this is the direction you want to go in? great, I'm going to help you go in that direction. Similarly, we saw with Paro, which we discussed in Hilchot Teshuvah, that Paro started out on his own. And we could even say that he started out as a responsible ruler, that he took a firm stand when he thought that his kingdom was being threatened from within. But as he himself strengthened and strengthened and strengthened his desire to his need to oppress and to punish the Israelites, at a certain point, God stepped in and said, if you want this so badly, I'm going to make it such that you cannot do anything else but. And obviously, if we're going down, and God forbid, if we're going down a negative path, there comes a point where, at the extreme, where God says, not only have you done evil, but you've done so much evil, and I've helped you to do the evil, and we've gotten to the point now where I'm going to make it impossible for you to which, God forbid that we should even go in that direction. And God being merciful, it's not likely to happen to most of us, but it's important to understand that this is the mechanism whereby Rambam is saying, if we do good and strive to do good, God helps us to do good. If we do evil, we strive to do evil, God gives us what we ask for. The Garden of Eden, okay, the reward of the commandment is the commandment, the reward of sin is sin. The Garden of Eden is a fertile place containing the choicest of earth's resources, rivers and fruit-bearing trees. God will disclose this to us someday. God will teach us the way to it, and we will be happy there. It's possible that many exceedingly wonderful plants will be found there, plants which are far pleasanter and sweeter than those which we know now. None of this is impossible or even improbable. On the contrary, paradise would be possible even if it were not written in the Torah. How much more sure then, since it is in the Torah, and the Torah specifically promises it. Gehinnom is the name for the pain and the punishment which will come upon the wicked. No specific description of this punishment is contained in the Talmud. One teacher says the sun will come so close to the wicked that it will burn them. And he finds proofs for this in the verse, for behold, the day comes and burns as a furnace, and the proud and those that work wickedness shall be stubble. Others say that a strange heat will be produced from within their own bodies and incinerate them from within. They find support for this position in the pasuk, your own spirit is a fire that will consume you. The resurrection of the dead is one of the cardinal principles established by our teacher Moshe Rabbeinu. A person who does not believe in this principle has no real religion. Certainly not Judaism. However, resurrection is only for the righteous. This is the meaning of the statements in the Midrash and Midrash Rehavia, which declares the creative power of rain is for both the righteous and the wicked, but the resurrection of the dead is only for the righteous. After all, how could the wicked come back to life, since they are dead even in their own lifetime? Our sages taught the wicked are called dead even while still alive. The righteous are called alive even when dead. All humans must die and their bodies decompose. So again, just notice that Rambam says Gehinnom is the name for that state of people who are subject to karet, but he says it's not really described, not even in the Gemara, which I think again strengthens my understanding of Rambam's view of heaven and not hell. It's either heaven or not heaven, which is bad enough. Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah, refers to a time in which sovereignty will revert to Israel, and the Jewish people will return to the land of Israel. Their king will be a very great king with a royal palace in Zion. His name, all nations, and even in even greater measure than did the name of King Solomon. All nations will come to make peace with him. All countries will serve him out of respect for his righteousness and the wonders which occur through him. All those who rise against him will be destroyed and delivered into his hands by God. All the verses of the Bible testify to his triumph and to our triumph with him. However, except for the fact that sovereignty will revert to Israel, nothing will be essentially different from what it is now. This is what the sages taught. The only difference between this world and the days of the Messiah is that oppression by other kingdoms will be abolished. In the days of the Messiah, there will still be rich and poor, strong and weak. However, in those days, it will be very easy to earn a living. A minimum of labor will produce great benefits. This is what the sages say when they say, in the future, the land of Israel will bring forth ready baked bread and fine woolen garments. This is rather like what people say when someone finds something ready for use. They say, oh, so-and-so found this bread already baked and the meal already cooked. The scriptural support for all this is the expression, the aliens shall be your plowmen and your vine dressers. This verse suggests there will be sowing and reaping, even in Messianic time. And so the world of Mashiach looks just like our world, except that sovereignty has returned to Israel. I'm not going to go into the theology of whether or not we are in or beyond the times of Mashiach, but note, Baruch Hashem, that Medinat Yisrael is established, that the sovereignty has returned to us. We are no longer subject to the rulership of other nations, that alien workers are our plowmen and vine dressers. And that has also come true. It's not an unmitigated good. I believe that with my own personal belief, I'm not telling anybody else what to think, is that the times of Mashiach are very challenging. Times of Mashiach, as Rambam is describing them, it's not like somebody's going to come down from the sky and wave a magic wand and everybody's going to be happy. They're going to require us to work. Times of Mashiach is going to require us to be vigilant. It's going to require us to be on our game, to continue to learn Torah, and to continue to strive and to improve ourselves through mitzvot and masim tovim, good deeds, and to maintain a just society. But we will have a clearer direction because we will be in our own sovereign state, and we will be responsible for that sovereign state. The Talmud records the irritation of one of the sages with a student whose objection to this passage showed that he did not understand his teaching because he understood the verse literally. A student here, a Talmud who, again, was in the first group. You remember the first group of weak people who read the surface text and believe that it's to be taken literally. The sage replied to him incorrectly in accordance with the student's inadequate understanding of the matter. The reason for his refusal to give a true answer is taken from the verse in Proverbs. Answer not a fool according to his folly. The great benefits which will occur in those days include release from oppression by other kingdoms, which prevents us from fulfilling all the commandments, a widespread increase in wisdom in accordance with the scriptural promise that the earth shall be full of the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea, and the end of the wars, again in accordance with the scriptural statement. Nation will be widespread with the result that people will merit the life of the world to come. But the Messiah will die, and his son and his grandson will reign in his stead. The prophet has already predicted the death of the Messiah by saying, he shall not fail nor be crushed till he has set the right of the earth. However, his reign will be a very long one, and all human life will be longer. There's no reason for surprise that the Messiah's reign will extend for thousands of years. As our sages have said, when good is gathered together, it cannot speedily be dissipated. We do not long and hope for the days of the Messiah because of an increase of productivity and wealth, which may occur then, or that we may ride on horses and drink wine to the accompaniment of song, as some confused people think. The prophets and the saints looked forward to the days of the Messiah and yearned for them, because then the righteous will be gathered together in fellowship, and because goodness and wisdom will prevail. They desired it also because of the righteousness and the abundant justice of the King Mashiach, Melech Mashiach, the Messianic King, because of the salutary influence of the King's unprecedented wisdom and his nearness to God. They also anticipate the performance of all the commandments of the Torah with neither inertia on the one hand nor compulsion on the other, in fulfillment of the scriptural promise, they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin will I remember no more. Similarly, it is written, I will put my Torah in their inner parts, and I will write it in their heart. Scripture also says, and I will take away the stony heart of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. There are many other verses with this same promise. Thus, people will achieve the world to come. The world to come is the ultimate end toward which all our effort ought to be devoted. Therefore, the sage who firmly grasped the knowledge of the truth and who envisioned the final end, forsaking everything else, taught all Israel have a share in the world to come. Nevertheless, even though this is the end, we should not serve God in order to attain the world to come. One should rather believe that wisdom exists, that this wisdom is the Torah, that the Torah was given to the prophets by God, the Creator, that in the Torah God taught us virtues, which are commandments, and vices, which are sins. In so doing, one will perfect the specifically human which resides within each of us and will be genuinely different from the animals. When one becomes fully human, one acquires the nature of the perfect human being. There is no external power to deny the soul eternal life. One's soul thus attains eternal life, the eternal life that it has come to know, which is the world to come. As we've explained, this is the meaning of the verse, be not as the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held with the bit and bridle. Restraints which prevent animals from acting in accordance with their nature are external restraints, like the bit and the bridle. With humans, the influences which restrain us are our control of self. When one achieves human perfection, that perfection restrains one from doing those things which are called vices and which withhold perfection. That restraint urges and impels one towards those things which are called virtues and which bring us to full perfection. This is what all the teaching of the sages have made clear about this most important matter. Says Rambam, I hope to write a book collecting all the sages' teachings on this subject from the Talmud and other works. I shall interpret them systematically, showing which must be understood literally and which metaphorically, and which are dreams to be interpreted by a wakeful mind. There I shall explain the many principles of our faith, of which I have discussed a few here. You must make your own comparisons. Let no one blame me for the freedom with which I have used certain expressions or made certain statements in this book, though they may irritate some. Excuse me. For I have expiated on these points precisely in order to teach those with no training in theology, a subject which not every person can understand. We must remember in connection with this subject, and indeed with all others, that our religion is based on the following 13 principles. So now he's going to launch into his list of his 13 principles, which I would actually like to start with the next shir, because I believe they need to be addressed in a separate framework, if you will. Let's just talk a little bit about I would say that Rambam's view of the 13 principles, which he enunciates here. First of all, understand that for example, from the poem Yigdal, or from the 13 animamins, which are included in a lot of Sidurim. Rambam, in his view, these are both necessary and sufficient for a person to attain Olam Haba. That a person may not be a perfect Jew, a person may commit certain sins, but if one clings unswervingly, unwaveringly to the 13 principles, that's kind of the baseline. It's interesting that Rambam himself he lists the 13 principles here, and there is some scholarship that suggests that Rambam posits them here not as his own invention of something that is critical or definitional to being a good Jew, but rather that he's listed them or kind of condensed them from the very Perek, the chapter Chelek, that he's introducing here. And there are scholars who've gone through Chelek in detail and have traced each of the 13 principles to passages in the Talmud. And so they're saying that Rambam has taken from the Talmud what the Talmud itself considers the fundamental principles of Judaism. And although I haven't done that work myself, I would say that that's an approach that makes a lot of sense to me, knowing Rambam's depth of knowledge of Talmud and also his great reliance on Chazal. But there's I don't want to get into a huge discussion of the ins and outs of complexities of what are the various principles throughout history that people have said either do or do not constitute the sine qua non of Judaism. There have been different commentaries since Rambam. What happened, I think we mentioned this last time, was that the Yigdal poem was composed something like less than 200 years after Rambam's death. So around 1300, which indicates that by that time, the 13 principles, Rambam's 13 principles, had already gained great popularity just among the let's call them the common people, that the everyday Jews had embraced Rambam's 13 principles as kind of a baseline foundation for their faith. The more scholarly rabbinic approach elevated the 13 principles, 100 or 200 years later, as we mentioned, with the rise of Christian dogmatism in Europe, the Jewish scholars and rabbis felt the need to push back and create our own dogmatics to show that we have no less structured view of the world than the Christians had. And since our view of the world came first, it behooves us to spell out to the world what are the fundamental notions of view of the world. But we also have scholars or rabbis such as Abarbanel, whose criticism of the notion of the 13 principles is not to say that they're wrong, but to say that every single word of the Torah is equally true and equally important. And it's impossible to reduce the Torah to anything less than all of the Torah. And the 13 principles, in so much as they are kind of reducing the Torah for the common Jew, he said that it's not the proper way to approach Torah observance. And there's of course the notion of, do we the 13 principles, are they necessary? Are they true? There are other things which are also necessary to being a properly observant Jew. 13 principles do not contain a lot of what we consider to be fundamental Jewish notions or Jewish dogma, if you will. The notion of Jews being the chosen people, for example, is not part of the 13 principles. I just want to, I want to suggest that we take as broad a view as possible of these principles and use them as a springboard to contemplating our place as members of the Jewish people, to contemplating our place vis-a-vis our religion, in our relationship with God and our relationship with one another as well. And I would also say that there's an important principle at work here that we saw from that Rambam mentioned a number of times in Sefer Madad, and we'll just finish with this notion, which is that when he talks about heretics as people who lose Olam Haba, he says a heretic is one who, for example, who denies the existence of God, or who denies who accepts that God, but says that the God is not one but many, or a person who denies the notion of prophecy, or a person who denies the Torah came min hashamayim, or denies that every single word of the Torah was given by God and is true. And Rambam is taking I think it's important for us. It's a very, very Jewish approach to how we live in the world and to our relationship with God. Rambam is not saying a person who has doubts about Torah min hashamayim, a person who has doubts about every single word being true, a person who has doubts about the 13 principles, a person who has doubts about the nature or the existence of prophecy. He's not saying that a person who has doubts loses olam haba. To be a heretic, Judaism is an active religion. To be a heretic, one must state publicly for the record that one does not believe this, that one rejects that. One must not only state it, but one must also state it in such a way that when we try to correct that person or try to argue against that person, the person says, I know all that and I still reject it. In other words, you have to judicial punishments, for example, punishments by Beit Din, whether it's fining somebody, putting them to death, God forbid, it's very, very hard to punish somebody. The Torah makes us go way out of our way to impose a punishment. And so it's important for us to know that I think it's very important to stress that having a doubt is not the same as being a heretic. Having a doubt is not the same as rejecting the Torah. Having a doubt is, I would say, more engaging our mind. And having doubts is why Rambam, so this is early in Rambam's career, when he was writing his Perek Mishnayot, his commentary on the Mishnah. And his last great work, obviously, the Guide for the Perplexed, part of what the guide does is it addresses the very process of intellectually examining our relationship to Torah in light of our own mind, the ability of our own mind to understand, in light of science, in light of philosophy, which by its very nature is a process that raises doubts. And so Rambam says the purpose of revelation is, while we are working through intellectually and we still have our doubts, revelation guides us in the right direction. Revelation tells us where the boundaries lie, but it doesn't tell us, it doesn't answer our questions for us. Contrary to Rabbi Yehuda highlighted, revelation keeps us on the right path, but we must go down that path intellectually ourselves, because it is, as we said, Tzelem Elokim is our intellect. And the realization of why we're put in this world is for us to attain an intellectual connection with God. So just wanted to finish with a concept from Rabbi Norman Lamb, who was one of the great leaders and great thinkers of modern Orthodoxy, head of Yeshiva University. He made a distinction that he calls cognitive faith versus functional faith. And this is something, it's not a unique concept that he invented. It's, as Rabbi Nachman put it differently, he said, we should, when we're approaching a biblical text, we should let our mind, our fantasy run free. We should take any possible interpretation of the text and run it through our minds. But we should never use our own mental process as a justification for changing the halacha. The human mind, as one of the commentators on Rambam, Kreskas, said, we can't be responsible for our thoughts because thoughts arise randomly. He said, so you can't put a person in cherem, you can't put a person to death, you can't deny a person olam haba because they have thoughts, even what we might call heretical thoughts, because they have doubts. But the Torah requires of us certain behaviors. Rambam is telling us the more we follow those behaviors, the more it will help us to adjust and to correct our thinking. And the more our thinking progresses, the more our behavior will improve. The more our behavior improves, the more God will make it easy for us to continue development. And the more we continue in our mental and spiritual development, the more each of us will, Bezrat Hashem, will attain the unique relationship with God that God made possible for each of us through our unique blend of intellect, perception, imagination, moral perfection, or our attainment of moral perfection. Excuse me. And so, Bezrat Hashem, next week, let's just take a quick preview of the first of the 13 principles. But we will return to this, Bezrat Hashem, next week and start on that path. The first fundamental principle is to believe in the existence of the Creator, that there is an existent, That's a noun, an existing thing. Complete in all the senses of the word existence. God is that existent is the cause of all existence. In that existence, all else subsists and derives from it. It is conceivable, it is inconceivable that this existent should not exist. For should this existent not exist, the existence of all else would be extinguished and nothing would persist. If we imagine the absence of any other existing thing, God's existence would not thereby be extinguished or diminished, for unity and mastery belong only to God, since God is sufficient unto God's self. All else, angels or celestial beings or whatever else is in them or below them, needs God in order to exist. This first fundamental principle is taught in the biblical verse, Ani Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. The existence and the unity of God. All right, if you remember, this was the very beginning of Sefer Mada, the very opening lines of Yesodei HaTorah, that the foundation of all wisdom and the first principle is to come to know. Remember, we spent significant time understanding Rambam's use of language, and again, Sefer Mada was written in Hebrew, so Rambam chose his words very carefully. And he said that the Yesodot and Amud HaChochma leda sheyesham matzui rishon, to leda, not ledat, not to have knowledge, but leda, to come to know, to enter into the quest for knowledge. And so Rambam is telling us that we're not expected to know this, and we may never know it with the perfection of absolute knowledge, similar to the knowledge that we have, for example, that 2 + 2 = 4, or the knowledge that we have, for example, of my name, your name, that I'm wearing glasses, that I'm sitting here in this chair. But nonetheless, we must strive our entire lives to come to a knowledge of God, to come into, and the verb leda implies not just an intellectual knowledge, but an intimacy. And to know, says Rambam in those opening sentences, not that there is a God, but just that there is a first foundational thing that exists, is the core and the foundation of all existence. And everything derives from that. And so, Chevra, thank you for joining us today. It's a bracha for me to be a part of this group. I thank you for learning Torah with me and for helping me to move forward in my own path of Torah learning. Anybody have any comments or questions?
I did have a question, but I think you answered it. Since you mentioned that there is no concept of hell in Judaism, then what is the definition of Gehenna?
Okay. So I would say that, first of all, I didn't say that there's no concept of hell in Judaism, but I believe that to be the case, although there are other greater minds than I who insist otherwise. Baal HaTanya, for example, has a description of all the things that the soul will go through after this life in order to be purified, and some of them sound pretty rough. Excuse me, but I believe that in Rambam's view, I believe that Rambam did not embrace the notion of hell. And I think also that the rabbis who were criticizing him were influenced by Christian thought, where Christianity has a very, very, whole worked out, very, very vivid description or set of descriptions of hell, of the punishments that await the wicked. Rambam says that the word Gehinnom is what's applied to those who do not get into Olam Haba. And it's not clear. I mean, he says that the Gemara itself does not have a clear description of hell. He quotes a couple of passages which have to do with heat. One that says the sun will become so hot that we'll burn up, and the other that our bodies will generate internal heat and it'll cause us to spontaneously self-incinerate. But those two descriptions do not indicate that hell is a place, and perhaps also not a permanent state. I mean, after all, if we incinerate, then we're gone. And in this lifetime, it's I think, it throws the fear of God into one enough that if I mess up, I won't get olam haba. Right. So this was the if this was, for example, when Esav comes in and Yaakov is cooking up his lentil stew, and Esav says, "You know what? Ani holech lamut. I'm going to die. Give me some of that to drink." Yaakov says to him, "Sell me your birthright," and Esav says, "I'm going to die." And one interpretation of that, which is very common, is that I'm so tired and so hungry right now that if I don't get food right this moment, I'm just going to drop dead. But I think that's not the correct reading. I think the correct reading is Esav is saying, I'm going to die. When you're dead, you're dead. It's finished. There's nothing else. All that exists and all that matters is what happens in this world. And you know what? I'm hungry and that smells good. Give me some. What? You want my birthright? What do I care after? And Rambam is saying, no, that's exactly the opposite of what the Torah teaches us. Rambam is saying the Torah teaches us that there is a life after this life. It is not a life in time after this life, right? He said the world to come is not at some end of days. That's a different set of teachings. That's the teachings of Mashiach and of resurrection and so on. But that each one of us, the life of the world to come, excuse me, is where when we transition from this body, from this plane, we transition into Olam Haba. And there can be nothing worse to contemplate than the possibility of not getting that. I mean, isn't it punishment enough to know that once I'm gone, I'm gone? To have the vision of Esav become our reality. And so he says the Gehinnom is the word that's applied to that state, but he doesn't give us a description of it, as he gives a description which comes in the Gemara also. Gives us a pretty fleshed out description of Olam Haba. And again, he says the Gemara itself does not have an equivalent description of Gehinnom. So why should I create something that the Gemara has not taught? Does that help? Is that useful?
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else? Deborah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Just want to say thank you for an awesome shur this morning.
I want to thank Ryan and Mordechai for their tremendous dedication and their tremendous professionalism in making these recordings possible. I want to thank Rabbis Diamond and Goldberg of Chabad of Rechavia for honoring me by inviting me to learn Torah with this wonderful group. It's been over 2.5 years, and Bezrat Hashem will continue for many years to come. God willing, in peace and in harmony among all Jews and with the whole world.